Welcome back, everyone. We are here to talk about Chapter 10. We are going to discuss language in this chapter. All right, let's get started. Our lecture outline. We're going to start with a conversation about the organization of language, and that's going to include things like phonology, morphemes and words, syntax, and sentence parsing. Then we'll move a little bit quickly into prosody and pragmatics. And then we'll talk a bit about the biological roots of language, and then we will wrap up this chapter with some insights into how language affects thought. All right, let's get going with the organization of language. So first off, how we study language. This is a really good, important place to start. We have a field in usually anthropology that's called linguistics. And linguistics is the study of the elements of language. This is generally in the anthropology department because it's the study of, all humans and how they use language to communicate within their culture, things like that. So it's usually an anthropology program. Psycholinguistics is a psychology program. It's usually pretty interdisciplinary because most psycholinguists work closely with anthropologists and some other people who might be interested in this. And this is the study of the psychological processes that are involved in producing language and in comprehending language. So we have these two different fields. I have my minor in psycholinguistics. So I spent a lot of time over in the anthropology department taking classes in linguistics in order to get on the linguistic side of it. My mentor in graduate school happened to be a psycholinguist also. And so that's how I ended up minoring in that topic. We were really, as a pair, very interested in bilingualism, which is something that I won't really get into in this chapter, but I developed a 10-hour seminar on bilingualism that maybe I should put up on YouTube or something so people could enjoy it. Super fascinating stuff. But anyway, let's start off with some of the universals of language. These are characteristics that are shared by all natural languages. They are not necessarily true of generated languages such as Esperanto. That doesn't necessarily follow these principles. And then also sign languages don't necessarily have all of these characteristics because those are languages that were created on purpose, as opposed to the natural languages, which are very different, honestly. These characteristics that are present in all natural languages help to define what it means to be a language, as opposed to other kinds of behaviors. So these characteristics show that language is different from other kinds of behaviors, right? That really language is the jewel in the crown of cognition, according to Steven Pinker, who is a psycholinguist. It's funny because when I was in grad school, back in the olden days of the 1990s, they were really striving to develop computer programs that could produce natural language the way that humans do, that you could take a non-speaking baby and in 2 years you have a language comprehender that can understand most of the things that are said to it, and also can produce at least 2-word sentences in response that are grammatically correct and relevant to the context. We have pretty good language generators these days, Siri and Google Assistant and stuff, but they have a lot of canned phrases that they say. That's not really them generating novel statements. They're just really good at finding information and then reading it out loud to you. That's what ChatGPT does too. It takes a bunch of information, ties it together, and it's not really generating language like a human can do, right? Some of the universals of our language would include things like arbitrariness. This phrase refers to the fact that there is no inherent connection between the symbols that we use in our languages and then the meanings of those symbols. Now, it's really important for you to learn right now that the term symbol in this case includes words. Words are symbols that take the place of real world things. So when I say something like computer, that is a symbol that generates in your mind an image of the thing that I'm referring to. So when we say symbols, it's not just those letters that you're seeing on the screen. Those can also be symbols. Numbers can be symbols. Symbols are something that takes the place of something else, right? And so there is no inherent connection between the words in our language and then their meanings. If you know a language, you know the connection between the symbol and its meaning. The better you know the language, the more fluently you understand the connection between the symbol and its meaning. The better access you have to that symbol and its meaning. I thought I had a picture coming up next. Hold on, where's my, here. So ignore the semanticity for a second. Here's an example of arbitrariness. Here we have the word microorganism, right? A very long word to describe a very small thing. And then we have a very short word like whale to describe something that's really enormous. It's arbitrary. You don't have to have a big word to represent big things and a small word to represent small things. You don't have to have a word that sounds blue to describe blue things. You don't have to have that. The meaning of the symbol is separate and distinct from the structure, the appearance, the sound of the actual symbol. Semanticity refers to the fact that language sounds carry meaning, and they are different from other non-language sounds. So all of us can produce language sounds. We put them together and we make language, but we also can produce non-language sounds. We have sounds that we use for sound effects, right? So maybe you have a sound that you can make, or you can make a sound, or you can make a sound, or right? There's all these different sounds that in English at least don't mean anything. And then we have other sounds that we make like ba and pa and ta and all these letter sounds that actually carry meaning. When I said those sounds, you were envisioning a B, a P, and a T because it means something. It's fun to watch little kids acquiring language because you can see them trying to make the connection between this arbitrary sound or symbol and then the meaning that it carries, the semanticity of that sound or symbol. It's fun to watch because it shows us the process. Another universal aspect of all natural human languages is that the language is flexible. The connection between the symbol and its meaning can change. As long as we all agree to it and we start using it that way, now it has a new meaning, right? So for example, back when they first invented cars, they were called automobiles. They actually were originally called horseless carriages because they looked a whole lot like the carriages that used to be pulled by horses, and then they made a motor instead of a horse, so they called it's a horseless carriage, and then it became an automobile, right? It's self-moving. And then ultimately now, I don't even know how we went from automobile to car. I don't even know how that happened, right? But now we have this new word that is the more common word, right, to call it a car. That's probably true in other languages too, that as things evolve, you start calling them different things, right? Now let's think about this. What is that? When you name this object that's on the screen, you probably have one of two things that you're saying. Normally I like to make my students say it out loud so I can enjoy it, but I can't hear you. You're probably saying one of two things, tissue or Kleenex, right? You're probably saying tissue. Maybe you might be formal and say facial tissue. You might say Kleenex. It's unlikely that you call that box a box of puffs, right? Which is a competitor of Kleenex for the market on facial tissue. The generic name is facial tissue. I think whoever makes this particular brand probably calls it facial tissue because, I mean, who even knows what brand this is? I think it says Chance. Oftentimes it's the first on scene that gets to be called the name, so now we call it Kleenex. Or it might just be the most popular one, the one that maybe didn't come on first, but it's the one that people tend to see more often or buy more often. I'm thinking of examples like Crayolas. You probably call those things either crayons or Crayolas. You probably don't call them, oh my gosh, they're Rose Art. There's another company that competes with Crayola, and they make, non-toxic I'm trying to think of the generic name. Crayons, yes. The generic is crayons. The brand is Crayola. You probably never call crayons Rose Arts, right? And maybe it's what rolls off your tongue most easily. There are a lot of factors that make for this kind of flexibility, right? What you hear more people calling it is interesting because, like, toilet paper has never gotten called generically, pass me the Charmin or something, right? We still call that toilet paper or toilet tissue. We don't call that by its brand name like we do facial tissue. And it may be because of the power of the brand called Kleenex. It might be because of the power of the brand called Crayola. Because when I was little, I called them crayons, and some of my friends called them Crayolas. So it can be the generic, right? You can have these words that are the generic, even though it's a specific. And that shows you how flexible language is, and that our understanding is that flexible, that we know that it can be called multiple things and still be indicating the same object. Naming is the principle that says for natural language speakers, we have a need for all objects to have names. To have an unnamed object is frustrating. Like, what is that? How are we supposed to refer to it? Right? So we have to invent names for new objects and activities. And then one of the things that you can see as these names develop and we start to use them is you can see the natural way that language emerges. Like, for example, the word Google. Yes, I used the old font because I liked it better. But it not only became the name of a thing, right? The search engine that you can type things into and it'll give you search results. It also became a verb, didn't it? So it's not just a noun. It's not just a search engine called Google. It is now a verb. Now you can Google things, right? Now, why didn't that happen with any of the predecessors of Google? There were a ton of search engines that came along before Google. Why don't we call it Yahooing stuff? Why don't we call it Binging stuff? Why don't we call it Exploring? Okay, that one makes sense. I guess you could say exploring, Netscaping. Anybody remember any of these old search engines I'm mentioning? Ooh, there used to be it wasn't a search engine. It was specifically designed to answer questions. And initially it was called Ask Jeeves. And then it became Ask. This is a good example of situations where it wouldn't make sense to make a generic phrase based on it. Can you imagine if you said, well, why don't you ask? Right? Ask doesn't make a good verb because we already have a verb called ask, don't we? So the fact that Google is a noun, we can now say Googling. And we impose the normal language processes, the normal language rules onto this new term, and we can use it that way. We have a lot of phrases in the English language that are based on baseball terms. So now we can say things like flied out. Flied out, how do you fly? That's not grammatically correct, but in the context of baseball, if you hit a pop fly, the announcer will say that you flied out. They won't say you flew out, they'll say you flied out, right? So this shows you that we need to have a name for all the things. And then the language is flexible enough that you can apply the normal rules to even these new names. So I've got pictures of like apps, right? We had to learn the name apps. And the word app came from application, and then they shortened it to app. And then now we have that as part of our vernacular. Or drones. When my son was younger, he had a drone, but it was one like this that has the 4 engines, and he would get so irritated if I called it a drone. He's all, it's a quadcopter. Whatever. These are arbitrary names to describe the object, and you know what I mean. You know what I'm talking about. That's the beauty of language. If we can agree on what the term is, we can all understand each other. In this particular example I'm giving that's classic teenage attitude toward parent, isn't it? It's like, I'm going to pretend like I don't understand what you mean because you're not using the term that I want to use for that thing. That's such a teenage thing to do. He knows my son is now an adult and he now knows if I say drone, just go along with it. If the other one that he finally gave up on is I call all game consoles Xboxes. And that drives him crazy. It's a PS2, it's a Nintendo, it's all, I'm like, I don't care. It's called an Xbox. And he learned that the names are arbitrary and just go with it. When I told him, okay, correct me one more time and we'll find out how it feels to not have your game console at all, you 13-year-old. So he decided to stop fighting with me. If I called it an Xbox, he knew what I was talking about. But see, I was putting in the brand name and I was misapplying it. It was like me calling all facial tissues Kleenex, right? It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it unless the 13-year-old wants to really contest the whole thing. Displacement is probably one of the most important aspects of language because it allows us humans to communicate with each other about things that happened in the past or the things that haven't even happened yet. They're maybe going to happen in the future. We can talk about things that exist in the world right now but aren't here, right? So I can refer to my office when I'm not there. I can talk about my car when I'm not driving it, right? We can talk about these things because language provides this displacement ability. I just told you a fascinating story about my son as a teenager, and you didn't need to be there. You didn't have to know anybody in the story. You could follow the story. You knew what was going on because of displacement. There are certain animal languages that kind of have some displacement. Like, for example, bees can do a little bee dance, they can fly to where there is nectar, fly back to the hive, do a little dance that tells the other hive mates where to fly to find the nectar. That's a little bit of displacement, right? They can talk about something that's not currently right here where the bees can currently, detect it with their sense organs. And then they can, those individuals who saw the dance now can go and find the nectar more accurately, right? Like that's a little bit of displacement. But they can't talk about, for example, remember last year when we found nectar in this spot, or next year let's come back and let's search that other area that we didn't get to this year. Like they can't talk about those kinds of things given the language that they have. So that's something very unique about human language. And when Pinker says that it's the jewel in the crown of human cognition, I think displacement is really the most important factor in that, being able to talk about things that aren't here right now. And then the final thing I wanted to list as a universal of language is this productivity. It's also by some researchers called generativity. This is the notion that most of the things that you say are completely novel. They've never been said before, right? When you're having a conversation, unless you have certain little phrases that are your catchphrase, those little things. I don't know if you're Bart Simpson and you say cowabunga dude, and that's like your catchphrase. But most of the time, the things that you're saying have never been said before. And that's amazing, right? There is no requirement that you use certain words or that you have only if you're in this particular context, you can only talk about this context. There's none of those kinds of limiting rules. And so productivity and displacement really are different for how us humans produce language compared to other animals, right? If you look at birds, they can communicate with each other, but they don't have productivity. They don't have the ability to generate completely novel bird songs and expect their fellow birds to understand it, right? If they make something up, the other birds just aren't going to respond to it because they don't have the ability to understand or comprehend completely novel statements by their fellow birds. Humans do have that ability, and that's so this bottom list, the bottom part of this list is really the part that makes language that humans produce completely different from any of the other languages that the animals have. We'll talk later about animal language, so I'm kind of foreshadowing some stuff. All right, let's go ahead and stop here. And actually what I'll have you do is watch this video next in the playlist, and then we'll come back and talk more about phonology.